Our second scripture reading is a continuation of what we just read from Mark. And it says, while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Is anybody in here familiar with the name Satoshi Nakamoto? Oh, you were in the last service. Of course, you know what it is. Satoshi Nakamoto. Anybody? Anybody? Nobody? I'm surprised you don't know it. Oh, we got somebody? Where? Yeah. Where? Go ahead. Bitcoin. Oh, there we go. Very good. Okay, that's awesome. Okay, the fact is that guy, Satoshi Nakamoto, he's the creator of a relatively new currency known as Bitcoin. Who here knows what Bitcoin is? All right, we got a few more hands up. Okay, so Bitcoin is a completely digital currency. It was introduced to the world in 2009, and so the only place you can find Bitcoin is online. That's the only place it exists. Now, this guy, Satoshi Nakamoto, he created Bitcoin in the wake of the 2008 financial meltdown. You all remember that, when that happened? Okay, so Nakamoto had become frustrated with the fact that the global economic environment was so unstable, and that our money, the value of it, was determined by banks and governments. So you all know, right, that one of the biggest issues with our money is that we have to depend on banks and governments to maintain its value. And so one of the ways that our governments try to get around this is that they try to back our money in something tangible sometimes, like gold, right? And the United States, we were on the gold standard until about 1971, when President Nixon took us off of the gold standard. And I'm sure that there are some people in here who remember just how upset so many people were. My grandfather was one of those. He's like, "This country was never the same once we came off of the gold standard." That's not even how my grandfather sounds. That's how he felt, right? So, one of the reasons why Nakamoto created Bitcoin is that he wanted to point out something fundamentally flawed with the way that we think about money. So you all are probably aware, right, that money, it's nothing more than a piece of paper. This paper, in and of itself, is worthless, except for the fact that when we look at it, we ascribe it value. So here's a question for you. Does a piece of paper with the words $100 written on it mean that it's actually worth $100? The answer? Only if you think it is. And that is true of just about everything in our world. We are constantly assigning value to the world around us. And what some people think is valuable, other people do not. Are you tracking with me on this so far? Okay, so what this leads to is this concept that when a majority of us think that something is valuable, that thing should be worth more. And likewise, when something is less valuable, that thing should be worth less. Are we in agreement on that? Okay, if a majority of people feel that way, that's how it should go. The problem with money, as Nakamoto sees it, is that the value of our money is not determined by the majority, but by a lot of external factors over which the average person has no control. So in 2008, when the entire global economy melted down, You and I, as average people, we had no control over the value of our money. The value of our money was determined by the governments and the banks that backed it. So Nakamoto, he wanted to create a currency that was not backed by a government or a bank, but rather a currency whose value was determined by the people. And this led to the creation of Bitcoin. Now, just in case you think Bitcoin is something that nobody in their right mind would actually care about, back in November of 2013, Bitcoin was worth $1,240 per unit. Per unit. Now, by the way, when Bitcoin came out originally, it was given out for free. So if you have a couple hundred units of Bitcoin, you could very easily be well off. The last time I was talking about Bitcoin, it was worth $11, and I was like, why did I not buy some Bitcoin? I could have been very well off. Anyways, that aside, what's amazing about Bitcoin is it's come down since then, and it's worth about $220 to $230, depending on the day, right about now. And you can use it online to buy anything you want. I'm serious. You can use it on Amazon, anything you want. You can buy real goods with this currency. So what's so bizarre to me is that even though this currency, which is essentially a bunch of computer code, right, is worth $230 a unit, what's even more bizarre than that is the man who created Bitcoin. For you see, nobody actually knows who Nakamoto is. Nobody's ever met this guy, and there is no known programmer by that name. In fact, shortly after introducing Bitcoin to the world, Nakamoto disappeared. He put a message on a board saying that he'd moved on to other things, and he's never been heard from since. And it is with that mystery that I'd like to turn to our gospel lesson for today. Now today, we pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago. Now 2 weeks ago, what was happening was Jesus, he had gone across the Lake of Galilee to the side that is considered to be Gentile. That word Gentile just means non-Jewish. So he's on the non-Jewish side, and he encounters this man named Legion, and Legion is a demoniac. Now I told you, today we would not call him a demoniac, a demon-possessed man. What would we call him today? He would be a schizophrenic today. So Jesus heals this guy, jumps back in the boat, goes back to the Jewish side of the lake, and when he's over there, he comes off the boat and he encounters this big crowd of people who are waiting for him. Now, one of the people in this crowd is this guy named Jairus. He's the leader of one of the local synagogues, and he says, Jesus, would you come back to my house? My daughter is very sick, and she needs your help. I think she's close to death. Jesus says, sure, be happy to go. So they're walking along, and the crowd follows behind. Now, in the midst of this crowd, there is a woman who is suffering from a hemorrhage. In fact, she's been suffering from it, according to the scriptures, for the last 12 years. Most scholars believe that that word hemorrhage, it's referring to menstruation. So this woman has been continually menstruating for the last 12 years. Now, whenever I talk about this text, all the women in the audience develop sympathy pangs on their faces, right? Because they know far better than the men how horrific that would be. But don't feel too much sympathy for her yet, because that number 12, if you remember, when I talk about 12, it's a symbolic number, right? Okay, if you were here during my sermons in Advent, I told you that 12, what does it usually stand for? It stands for the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. So that number 12, it represents Israel. So, by saying that this woman has been menstruating for 12 years, Mark is trying to say that this woman represents Israel. Now, why does this woman represent Israel? Well, to get into it, I need to give you a little bit of background. So usually, when you hear a pastor preach on this particular text, the pastor will tell you that because this woman has been menstruating, that she is in violation of the laws of the Old Testament, and therefore she would be considered ritually impure. That concept of being ritually impure, what that means is that according to the third book of the Bible, Leviticus, there's this law that says that she would be unclean. Anything that she touches would be unclean. Okay? And so people kind of have to stay away from her. In fact, in the Old Testament, in these laws, it says that a woman who is menstruating, she has to live outside of the encampment. She can't be with her family. So I was taught when I was in seminary that this woman, she would not have been allowed to be around her friends, her family. She couldn't have had children. She couldn't have been married. None of that stuff. She essentially would have been isolated from the rest of society. I have since done some research on first century Palestine. Beyond my seminary education, I've come to find that's actually not true. That, in fact, according to Jewish laws, and this is very important that you understand, Christians tend not to understand this concept of Jewish uncleanliness very well. But essentially, the only thing she would have been prevented from doing is going to religious services like this. And that means that if there was a synagogue in her village, she couldn't have gone to the synagogue. But that's assuming that there even would have been a synagogue, because not every village had a synagogue. So her life might really not have been that much different, except for the fact that she had this condition. So the point of her presence in this story is not that she's unclean. So if you've heard that in the past, dismiss that. The point is that she is bleeding. Now, the ancients believed that blood was the life force of an individual. They didn't understand what was in blood that made people live, like they didn't understand the concept of cells and hemoglobin and all that stuff. But what they did understand is, without blood, you die. So if this woman represents Israel, then what Mark is trying to say is that Israel's life force is slowly draining out of them. Now, why is Mark trying to make this commentary on Israel? Well, to understand, we have to walk through the rest of the story. So, Jesus, remember what's happening? He's walking along, and what's he doing? He's going to see this young girl who's sick. And the crowd, you know how it is when crowds are all trying to follow together, this big crowd. Everybody's bumping into each other. They're trying to get to the same place. And Jesus, well, he's this really famous guy. So people, they all want to be around him. They want to be near him. And so this woman, she thinks to herself, if I can just touch his clothes, if I can just touch his clothes, then maybe, just maybe, I can be healed from this horrible tradition. So as they're walking along, she reaches out and just barely touches his clothes. And in that instant, the scripture says that she is healed. Now, we can assume that this woman didn't think that Jesus would notice that, because everybody's kind of all huddled together. But Jesus stops, he turns around, and he looks at this crowd, and he says, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, his disciples are a little confused by this, because they're looking at him like, "Yo, dude, I don't know if you noticed, but you're in a big crowd of people. Everybody's touching your clothes." But he says, "No, who touched my clothes? I felt the power go out from me." Now, this woman, who could have remained anonymous, she's in the crowd, she comes forward, and she kneels at Jesus' feet, and she's trembling, according to the scripture. Why? Because if you know anything about Middle Eastern culture, you know that it is inappropriate for a woman to touch a man who is not her husband. Depending on the area and the customs, it can have different kinds of repercussions. So it could be as simple as the man saying, "Don't touch me," you're not supposed to do that, to the man being able to physically assault the woman, to the man being able to send her to prison, to the man actually being able to put her to death. It depends on the area and the customs. So she's at his feet, and she's trembling because she's scared. Because she knows that Jesus, if he wants to, can hurt her. But he doesn't do that. In fact, quite the opposite. He lets her go, and he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Now, I've always found that to be such a strange statement. I remember the first time I read it when I was 19 years old. I was like, this is weird. The reason being, shouldn't he have said, "Daughter, I have made you well"? Because isn't Jesus the one doing the healing, right? But he doesn't say that. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." It's almost as if Jesus is giving this woman the credit. He's saying, you're the cause of your own healing. You're the one that did it. Now, why would he do that? If you remember when I preached back in fall, I was preaching about some of Jesus' healings, and I told you that I don't chalk Jesus' healings up to mystery or magic. I said, I think there's a very reasonable explanation for how he was able to heal the people who he healed, and it actually tells us right in the scriptures how he did it. Well, today we have come across that explanation. Have you all ever seen what they do when they do clinical trials of drugs, pharmaceutical companies? What they do is they have various groups of people, and one of those groups is known as a placebo group. The placebo group is a group of people who has a particular illness, and they are given a medicine, a pill, right? But it actually has no medicinal value in it whatsoever. It's usually a sugar pill. And the reason why they do that is they want to compare the effects of a group who doesn't get anything with the group who's getting the medication to make sure that the medication is doing what it's supposed to do. But what they have found is that in these placebo groups, some people end up actually getting better. That in fact, even though they're taking a pill that has no medicine in it whatsoever, their brains think that they're taking a medicine, and then they end up being cured from their ailment. What does this tell us? It tells us that our brains are the best and the greatest healer that we possess. I once heard a doctor say to me, the best pharmacy you have, Alex, is right up in your head. The problem is that most of us don't know how to unlock the potential of our brain to heal our bodies. However, sometimes if there's an object outside of us that we believe that can heal us, that object could be a pill. That object could be somebody like Jesus. Then, inadvertently, we can trick our minds into unleashing and unlocking all of that potential inside. So, this woman, she was able to unlock all of that potential in her brain. And I think that Jesus knows that about us as individuals. He understands that if there's something beyond us, that we can end up being healed. And I think that's why he says to her, your faith has made you well, because he understands that he has become the object of her faith. And what's more is that Jesus admires this woman. He admires the fact that she has so much faith, because not everybody has that. And so this woman, think about it, this woman is at his feet. She's trembling. Everybody around her, they think to themselves, she deserves to be hurt. She's worthless. She has no value. Jesus sees a great amount of value in this woman. Value that nobody else can see, because he can see her faith. So if this woman represents Israel, then Mark is trying to say that the reason why Israel's life force is draining out of them is because they have no faith. That's what he's trying to say. And this interpretation is backed up later on when he gets to the young girl's house. Remember, she's now dead. Now, how old is that girl, by the way? 12. So she also represents Israel, right? And what does he do? He brings her back to life. And what does he say? He says, do not fear, only believe. Do not fear, only believe. Now, whether or not Mark's critique of Israel not having any faith is valid, that's a whole other topic for a whole other sermon. Because, frankly, he may not be correct about that. But that's his critique. He's allowed to make the critique he wants to make. The most important thing I want you to take away from this is that this story is trying to help us understand the value of our faith. The value of our faith. And this is why I talked about Bitcoin at the beginning of the sermon. I talked about Bitcoin because I wanted you to understand that we assign value to things in this world that are valueless. Just because people think a Bitcoin is worth $230 does not make it so. It's just a bunch of computer code, right? And just because a woman is sitting at your feet and everybody around you thinks that she's done wrong and that she's worthless does not make it so either. What Jesus is telling us is that the things that we should value in this world, they are often overlooked, while the things that we do value are often meaningless. One of the most valuable commodities you possess is your faith. Your faith is the key that can unlock the door to a life that is worth living. And I want you to understand, if you take nothing else away from this sermon, I want you to understand one thing, and that is a correlation. There is a correlation between what you value in this world and the depth of your faith in God. When you value the right things, that positively affects your faith. When you value the wrong things, it negatively affects your faith. Let me give you a quick example. Have you ever met someone who has been given a diagnosis of terminal cancer? If you have, then you know that when that person has been given that diagnosis, they start focusing on the things that matter. They don't care about money. They don't care about material possessions. All they care about from that point forward is being with the people who love them. And what's more, they often start to focus on their relationship with God because they know at the end of the day, God is all they have left. So, that correlation there that I just talked about, you value the right things, your faith in God, it gets a lot better. Now, this contrasts greatly with somebody like myself. I am young. I am generally very healthy. I don't have a ton of problems in my life right now, a ton of difficulty. The things that I worry about are, am I saving enough for retirement? Do I have enough money to send my kids to college? Do I have enough money to pay my mortgage, right? And so when I look in my wallet and I see this piece of paper actually has a great deal of value to me. And as a result, that negatively impacts my faith. It's the truth, 100% all around. To be blunt, the people who have the greatest faith are the people who are enduring tough circumstances. They're going through difficult situations. They have to deal with problems in their life, like this woman, right, who we read about today. These are the people that have a deep faith. And I'm not trying to say that you all don't have difficulties in your life. I know many of you have really difficult things that you deal with. But the truth is that compared with many in this world, we are well off. And that the difficulties that we face are of a different level than what many people have to face on a day-to-day basis. And therefore, that impacts the depth of our faith. Are you following me on this? So, if you want the kind of faith that can move mountains, the truth is we have to redefine our values. We have to start valuing the right things, the things that actually matter, and we have to let go of those things that are meaningless in our lives. And so what this means is we have to do what Jesus did. We have to enter into people's difficulty. We have to enter into the places where they are hurting the most. He does this with the woman who has the hemorrhage, and he does this with the father who has the young daughter who just died. Now, we are going to provide you with just such an opportunity here at First Pres not long from now. Today, I meet for the first time with the research teams who are going to be figuring out the mission for our church. Today, we're going to get together, we're going to take all those ideas that you all brought forward at that brainstorming session, and we're going to see what we can do with those to make a new mission here. Now, I hope you guys are excited about this, because what this is going to do is, it's going to give us an opportunity to focus on the things that matter. It's going to give us an opportunity to get into people's lives and to really invest in those who struggle the way Jesus did. It's going to help us to focus on those things that matter, to reassess our priorities, to grow our faith, and to serve the least and the lost. So as you leave here today, I want you to think about something. That's long in the future before we're going to be to that, okay? So today, what you need to know and what you need to think about is that what you value impacts your faith. I want you to go home and I want you to think about what are the things that you actually value in this world? What are the most important things to you? And if those things are out of whack, then you know that that's going to impact your faith. And so I hope that what you might be willing to do is to value the right things. Because the truth is, we want to have the kind of faith that can move mountains. Because I guarantee you, having that kind of faith, it opens the door to a life that is worth living. Amen.